Without further ado, we're really pleased that Elving Geng is with us today, who is an alumni from here, as you'll hear. Dr. Elving Geng is currently a professor of medicine in the Division of Infectious Diseases in the Department of Medicine at Washington University in St. Louis. St. Louis? What are we supposed to say? St. Louis, right? Not St. Louis.
That's what we say.
I'm thinking of the movie. Meet me in St. Sorry about that. He earned his MD and MPH degrees from Columbia University, right here. So welcome home, and completed a postdoctoral fellowship training at the Aaron Diamond Institute when it was at Rockefeller. As we all know now, of course, Aaron Diamond is here with us at Columbia, which is really fantastic. And he also did some of his training at UCSF in San Francisco. Elving is director of the Center for Dissemination and Implementation at the Institute for Public Health for Washington University in St. Louis, and director of the NIAID-funded Midwest Center for AIDS Research. I could go on and on about his publications, about his teaching, about his grants, but I won't take time to do that. But let me just say that much of his research, as you'll hear about today, is centered on the use of evidence-based interventions in the public health response to HIV and non-communicable diseases, using implementation science, which he's really recognized as a global expert in implementation science. He has focused on retention and HIV treatment, person-centered public health strategies, adaptive approaches to service delivery, and practice facilitation. And he has employed a wide range of methods in this research, including sequential and cluster level randomization, choice experiments, mixed methods, decision analysis, and reviews. I know you're someone that a lot of people, including our teams, have turned to for your expertise in these methodologies. Dr. Geng has served on the World Health Organization's HIV Guideline Development Group, the World Health Organization Guideline Review Committee, National Academies of Science Commissions, and he holds editorial roles at PLOS Medicine, the Journal of International AIDS Society, and the Implementation Science Communications. So we're very, very pleased that you're with us for this round and for also the rest of the day's events and activities. Welcome, Elving.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Okay, so I just admit like this. Yeah. Okay. So good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here in New York, specifically on 168th Street, and you know, as Bob mentioned, I have, when I come to New York, I have like, you know, like youth memories of youth here, and they were really fantastic memories, and I feel like ever since leaving New York City, a little bit like you know, it's a place that I always have nostalgia for, and the people here are amazing, and there's no place else like it on earth. I mean, I've spent a lot of time going to a lot of places in the world, and there's just no place like this. So thanks for having me, and it's fun to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about mechanisms in implementation research and its implications for generalizing. It is a little bit of perhaps a slightly more kind of abstract or theoretical kind of talk. I'm going to use examples from HIV and try to make the case that even though it's a little bit theoretical, it is important, and it has immediate implications for how we think about empiric research that we do, particularly in implementation science. And I think that, yeah, so here's the overall kind of argument. We need and lack mechanisms and mechanistic thinking in implementation science. There are many reasons for this. It's a form of explanation. It helps our solutions work better. It enables generalizing. I'm going to talk about what mechanistic thinking might be like versus business as usual in implementation science. I'm going to try to make the case how graphs can help us, causal diagrams can help us think that way. And I have a few examples. I'm drawing here a lot from realist evaluation work, Posson and Tilley, from the transportability work and causal inference, and from critical realism, which is a sort of strand of thinking that predated realist evaluation and inspired it, but I think and it ended up kind of like headed in a slightly different direction. So so I think I'm going to give a little bit of just like a 30,000 foot background about sort of my perspectives on implementation science as a field, just to place, I think, the comments that will come, in part because it's an evolving area of conversation, and I think that different pieces of the conversation in different networks end up having quite different kind of assumptions about, basically where we're at and where we're going. So this is my sort of point of view. So I think research about implementation is clearly critically important. I think that piece of the movement is in my mind, like, not disputable. But how to go about doing this is, in my view, kind of an unsettled area of thinking. I think lots of things are contested in the field, even though we have already started to apply it. I think, for example, what implementation actually is an unsettled question, right? So you have definitions like Ann Sales's planned behavior change for evidence-based intervention, planned by who, for who, on what? And is it really planned? There are sociological theories that say that no social facts are planned, right? It's all the product of an emergent contested space where agents and structures interact. And no one person or even one group will know the outcome of any complicated effort to do something. And I feel implementation is often that way, right? You try to do something and it's a complex thing that spans the health structures and the communities, and what comes out the other end, sometimes you don't necessarily know. Carl May defines implementation as the strategic translation of the intentions of one group on the behaviors of another. So this is Carl May from normalization process theory. That is a provocative statement, because how does one group translate their intentions into the behavior of another? Like, that's, depending on how you do it, you can either, in my mind, like, win or lose, right? And there are good ways to do that and bad ways to do that. I don't think the field has taken those questions on, I think, with a lot of necessarily depth. So in general, I believe in our first principles over our current formulations. Okay, so I believe in the idea of implementation strategies. I believe that, like, having a concept of treatments in the implementation world is a critically important step to take to make implementation a field. But I'm not committed to any particular formulation or dictionary of strategies. And, people turn to Eric as an example of a sort of a compendium of strategies. Eric was derived by concept mapping, which is a way to generate some consensus, but among a very limited segment of people who work in this space, right? Like, if you look at the people who were in the Eric project, they are overwhelmingly North American. They're overwhelmingly, like, in the mental health space. And so it's a representation of how a subsegment of a segment of the community thinking about implementation thinks about strategy. So, which is not a criticism of it. I think it's great, and I think Byron Powell is a co-director with me at CDI and is a friend. But I think he would say that this is the first chapter, not the last, on what strategies are. Implementation outcomes. So implementation outcomes is another thing that's critical for the field of implementation science. If you want to have things that treat implementation, then you need to know, before you get to downstream things like service delivery and health, like, are you successful in changing implementation the way that you want it to? They can be thought of as, like, implementation outcomes or mediators of the downstream stuff. I think that idea, that space, is important. But the things that we have put in that space right now as a field, nobody is satisfied with, and we can't foreclose on the conversation to develop the concepts in those space, right? So you have, practice implementation outcomes, acceptability, appropriateness, et cetera. There's a handful of things that have filled that space in with concepts. I would say that I think acceptability is important, but I think that acceptability is an example of, I think it's like, if you want to know whether or not somebody, whether it's a healthcare worker or a patient, how they feel about some new intervention, whether it's a new form of therapy, a new vaccine, acceptability is the lowest possible threshold by which you want to understand their experience of it. And it's very highly dimensional, right? You could have everything from like disgust to joy when you interact with something like that. And it could be affective, it could be cognitive, it could be social, there's lots of important concepts in that space that we need to like flesh out and agree on. One of the most common questions I get when I do like lightning rounds and stuff are people like, should I use FIM, AIM? These three question things. Everybody uses them because they're handy, they're published, you put them in a grant, but I don't know anybody who uses them who's like, these were awesome. Everybody's like, they suck, but I'm gonna put them in my grant, right? So as a field, we have to take the next step. And it's not an easy next step. Like, so what should we put in that space? I mean, it takes time, energy, and thinking. So kudos to like Brian Weiner and people for putting that out there. And it's the job of like the field to, write the next chapter. So in all said and done, I think we should apply what we know because we're not perfectionists, but we should be held back about thinking about the basis of the field. And in fact, so we have a training program that it's a week-long in residence sort of training program, HIRI, in St. Louis every summer. It's half US based, half globally based people, and especially in the context of global health, right? Like it's important to me that we explicitly avoid saying, this is implementation science, learn it, right? What we say is, this is cookie dough, and we invite you to cook it with us, right? So we are going to create cookies together with your input. Okay. So with that, I thought it might be helpful just to put a couple of my assumptions out there. Okay. With that, I'm going to talk a little bit about mechanisms. So there's kind of a little bit of a buzz around mechanisms in implementation science. Kara Lewis and group et al. Have a special collection in implementation science on mechanisms. There's always sessions at the meetings on like mechanisms, and there are a number of different sort of like R13 type things focused on mechanisms, and so it's become like a buzzword. The social sciences have been dealing with mechanisms for a long time and have been doing so in very interesting ways. And many people have been involved in this conversation. Kosuke Imai has written a lot about this. And it turns out, as I was trying to educate myself more on mechanisms is actually a big topic in the philosophy of science. And this guy, Carl Craver, he's actually at WashU, is a philosopher of science. He's in the philosophy department, writes about science, and he writes about mechanisms. So there's a lot there, and about a couple of years ago, I cold emailed him, and I said, hey, guess what? There's this thing called implementation science, and people here are like talking about mechanisms and like love to pick your brain. And he actually responded, and so I was like, oh, let's meet for coffee. And I said, let's meet at Caldi's. And those of you who know St. Louis know that, number one, the only coffee shops are Caldi's. And number two, there's like 6 Caldi's by the medical school. So he went to one Caldi's and I went to another Caldi's, and we like missed each other. So all the light bulbs that could have went off didn't. So I'll have to try again. Okay. So that actually, it sounds like Elvin. Yeah, I'll tell you a follow-up story on that after we're good. Okay. So why is context important? Mechanisms important? Well, I think in implementation science, it can help us exit one of our sort of fundamental conundrums in the field, which is this conundrum, in my view, about context, right? So in implementation science, people say context is king. You hear that term like all the time. So what does that actually mean? What that suggests, I think, is that when you do something, even if you were able to do something similar or the same in a different place, in a different setting, you would get different results, right? You would have different effects. Because there are things in that local environment that will affect how your strategies play out. And these are all strategies are complex behavior change strategies at the level of the patient, the provider, the organization, and many things influence those things. And those things are all different in different places. So now there is empiric support for this, right? So if you look at systematic reviews of things like drugs, you get heterogeneity, but you don't get that much heterogeneity. If you look at systematic reviews of things like audit and feedback or practice facilitation, you get a lot of heterogeneity. Audit and feedback goes from minus 30 to plus 300, right? And the same thing is true for a lot of different implementation strategies. And I think that much, so there's empiric support for the fact that these things generate different effects. The other thing is more of a values thing. And I think in implementation science, we care about solutions in all of those settings, right? The heterogeneities are meaningful for us. And we would like to solve our implementation problems, not by shifting the normal curve to the right slightly, which is great because it will maybe has large population effects, but people care about solving the implementation problem in all the contexts, right? So this is one context, this is one context, this is one context. We would like to be able to at least ameliorate what's going on in all of those places. So differences matter to the goals of the field. And that's related to kind of like equity in some way. Okay, but if every implementing environment is unique and we care about these differences, like is generalizing possible? Do we have to have a different solution for every place that we work in? Do we need to have a different implementation strategy? Does each strategy always have to be recontextualized for every setting in order to learn about what works in that setting? Because if that's true, then one of the fundamental notions of like a scientific project generalizing is potentially like unobtainable. So I call this the context trap. Like we sing we praise we elevate context, but then we still want science. So what are we going to do? I think the argument here is going to be that a mechanisms-based approach can help us like navigate that conundrum. Okay, so what is a mechanism? A mechanism is a form of an explanation, and this is a figure taken from one of Carl Craver's books. We're basically like he says like basically there's a phenomenon, okay, or an effect. They use that word. He uses that word interchangeably. That's this black circle, and then underneath that effect, how it happens is composed of basically like four things. So it's constituent parts, the causings, a consistent relationship between the parts, and a consistent like a stable over time, somewhat stable over time organization of the parts, right? And so this is like a very, very simple definition. It's like you have a phenomena. What are the component causings, concepts and causings, things and causings, structures and causings that make up that phenomenon? So you can imagine this is a physiologic process. It could be an implementation process. It could be many, many different things. Okay. So mechanisms, how are mechanisms gonna help this? And this is just a slide that says, I think that the mechanisms conversation is not only about generalizing. There's a lot of, talk about getting beyond barriers and facilitators and making strategies more effective, et cetera, interactions with other discipline, but I'm going to focus on this context and generalizing one. Okay. We'll get to some HIV examples soon, I promise. But this is a little bit of a heuristic. Okay, so this is generalizing 1.0. Learn in a sample and infer in the real world. So this is what I call like traditional generalizing. You have some target population context. You apply study methods to get a group of people that come from there, and then you study them, and then you generalize back into that population, right? So there's one real world, you study it and you get it back. And is this like, this isn't all that easy to achieve actually, because you have to know what context and what people that you care about, sample, and all the traditional things about research. But what I think what we're saying as a target of what we want to learn in implementation science is we would actually want to, if the real world is composed of a large number of target contexts where the real effects differ. So let's say you could actually deliver a strategy, with fidelity, which is a whole other question. Let's say in context A, the effect is 2, and in B it's 1, and in C it's 4. And in the real world, there are a lot of these kinds of settings. How is it possible to study A, understand the treatment effect in A is 2, and yet infer in B that it's 1, and then C that it's 4? So I think that's like essentially the goal. So how would we do that? I think it begins with the reconceiving of what we're trying to do from external validity to external validities, right? So that we give up on the notion of one quote unquote real answer, and we recognize that there are multiple real answers that we care about. And so what does that mean for sort of research findings? Okay. Throughout the next few slides, I'm going to use a directed, like a DAG, essentially as a tool. So I'm sure there's like lots of epidemiologists in this room. So for the most part, DAGs are used to help guide how we understand information that we have, right? So John Digitale and Murray Glymour recently wrote a review article about all the uses of DAGs, and there are things like you can use a DAG to understand like causal identification, like what it would take to analyze a set of data in such a way that you could plausibly make a causal claim about like treatment A and outcome like B. You can use it to figure out how you specify your models. You can use it to identify like excuse me, potential so-called backdoor paths, like colliders, collider bias, confounding, things like that. I'm using DAGs here for something far more simple. We're not going to get into any of that. We're just using it to represent a conceptualized causal system, right? So in a DAG, there's a word, which is a concept, and an arrow that says this has an effect on that. We're not going to talk about anything quantitative. It's just qualitative. It's like this has an effect on that. So we have to imagine what, if the strategy has an effect on an implementation outcome, what its mediators are. And then the one other thing that's interesting about this, or about this tool, is that when two arrows point into one thing, it implies that that thing has an effect on the other effect. So in DAG land, I think there's a lot of debate about whether or not that is effect modification. It's not, but it would be if it was projected onto a numeric scale. So if two things point into one thing, there's effect modification if projected onto a numeric scale, on either the additive or the multiplicative scale as a rule. But at any rate, we can represent a system this way. For what it's worth, this is pretty simple. This would be very difficult to describe in English. You would have to use a lot of words in several paragraphs, and it still wouldn't be clear. So what I'm saying is that we can represent how we think things work better with different tools than either statistical notation, which this becomes like also very difficult, perhaps impossible, and then or with words. Okay. So I'm going to walk through how mechanisms get us to generalizing in a different way through the example of CAGs. So we all remember CAGs. I submitted an abstract called DAGs for CAGs to a conference about 10 years ago, and it was rejected so fast that I would give it up on it. But anyway, so remember CAGs, okay? Like CAGs. So my guess is everybody here knows what a CAG is, but 10 years ago, 12 years ago, maybe 15. So PEPFAR scaling up HIV treatment around the world. The WHO 4S's say simplification and standardization, right? You want to scale, do everything the same, exactly the same, fast, and get bigger. And one of the things was that all patients got 30 days of drugs. So you came, you got 30 days of drugs. And you had to come again in 30 days. And that was partly because of supply chain, but also partly because, you just wanted to do things exactly the same and not think about it too much. I think that was very successful for scale up. But then after a while, it became obvious that the people who were healthy and doing well, like coming back to the clinic every month kind of sucks. And people spend a lot of time and money and things like that. And so in Mozambique, apparently there were these groups that were initially self-forming, but then later got brought into the health system, where you have groups of 6 people, and then one of them goes to the clinic, picks up drugs for the other 5. That way, you only have to go twice a year now instead of 12. It saves you a lot of time and energy. And it was originally reported from Mozambique. And so the question is, in my external validity or implementation trial 1.0, the question becomes like, do CAGs work? Okay, so let's say you were to take that frame of mind that there's one external reality, and you do a randomized trial, you do a cluster randomized trial, you randomize half the places to like nurse-initiated CAGs and half places to not. You look at some service delivery outcome or implementation outcome, you describe the context, right? Because in implementation science, everybody's saying describe the context. So you're like, okay, I'm going to describe the context. It's rural, and people speak this language, and there's like 2 languages in this area, and stuff like that. And then you will get an answer if you do a trial like that, right? Let me see if I do this. Okay, here's the answer. Hire nurses, identify candidates. You try to be pragmatic, remove trial artifact. You measure the CAG, offering the CAG on patient retention, viral load. You collect information about context. Sorry, I said that earlier. And then you collect implementation outcomes, acceptability. You get an answer. Okay, say it improves medication precision ratio by 40%. Okay, that is an answer. And in fact, that will go into WHO guidelines. So like some systematic reviewer using GRADE will suck it into the evidence review thing and say that there's randomized evidence for it. But the question of whether or not CAGs work is not fully informative, right? Because we all intuitively know that the effects of CAGs depends, right? It depends. And it depends on various things. It depends on where people live, drug stock, stigma in the community, social capital, et cetera. And so when we do a trial, if we think about sort of mechanisms and external validity 2.0, what can we do to build into our trial some things that can teach us about not only that it depends, but what it depends on and how much it depends on those things. Okay, so so I would say that, like, in order to do that, to understand like what affects the effects, we should start with an explanatory theory of how a strategy works. So right now, there are all these like recommendations in implementation research about how to pick and tailor a strategy, right? Like go to Eric and then tailor. I would say that everything in Eric needs a DAG. Everything that everybody is doing needs a DAG, because it will help clarify what that thing is supposed to be doing. And it's not all that easy. Like if you try to draw an explanatory mechanistic account of practice facilitation, it's not that easy, but it needs to be done in order for us to collectively understand what practice facilitation is, and therefore what it can be done. So I was a part of a review that Amy Kilborn, who's a sort of a practice facilitation expert, led like a couple of years ago. And we have a paper that has like basically a DAG. And it was pretty interesting. Okay, so first of all, she convened like 10 or 12 people that are facilitation experts, and we had a bunch of Zoom calls, which I thought were Zoom calls, but later I found out were focus groups. But as a part of some kind of Delphi process. But anyway, so there is a dag in that paper. I think it's okay. I think it's solid. But like, if you question every piece of it, it's not like let's put it this way. How facilitation works, even if you were to pool all the experts in the world, is a work in progress. And more needs to be done on it, but we have something relatively useful. But without drawing it down in a diagram, I don't think we could have written 1,000 emails that could have communicated to each other, whether or not we even agreed with each other, right? Like, you're like, oh, what about this? But this is, so so like, using that kind of thinking, what can be done in a trial? Well, here is what I would say we might be able to do. Okay. Base the trial on a theory of strategy. Okay, you can get that from literature review. You can get it from qualitative data. This is related to program theory from realist work, or middle range theory. I call it sort of like micro theorizing, because this is about a strategy and not like something macro like society. And the output of the trial is evidence about the strategy, and also evidence about some of these things that you can collect along the way. Okay, so in constructing these sort of a diagram or a causal diagram, well, how do we populate the concepts? Well, first, I would say that we should draw from frameworks and implementation. This is where like what I personally try to do with all the implementation science constructs is like I put arrows between the things. So this is a Proctor's actor action target. So my addition to this is just to putting the arrows between the things, which says like, if you want to understand this system, there's an actor, they take actions, there's action targets, which are things that are upstream of behaviors, and then there's behaviors. What kinds is the actor doing the actions that are meant to be done? Does the action reach the action targets that it's meant to reach? Does training change capability? Does facilitation change motivation? Does a conditional cash transfer change opportunity, et cetera? And do those things change behavior? So using that kind of idea and drawing from other relevant concepts, I would say you can put together kind of like a theory of a strategy. And just for the sake of like brainstorming with DAGs, these are just some of the concepts that came up. There's like opportunity cost, right? That's an economic idea. Like, there's also Carl May's work of treatment, the idea that like receiving treatment is work, which I think is an interesting way to frame the work that patients have to do to get treated. There's also the notion of activation seems like it could be relevant, right? Like Hibbard's, if you're a part of a CAG, you feel activated. Social support in healthcare, microclinics, things like that. There's also the notion of like interactions at the facility, the health investment model, and then the relationship between patients and providers, and the discretion that providers have when they treat patients, and like that comes a little bit from Lipsky's street level bureaucrat work. But at any rate, you can think about what a CAG does from the point of view of like a structure like that Proctor might offer, and then concepts that we draw from the wider behavioral sort of literature. And what we do with this is we can put together basically an explanatory theory of how CAGs work. So this is, I think I would love to like get into the nuances of this, but this is like a reasonable representation of how CAGs work. And this is drawn from some papers, Rascher, Jacru, Mukabang, others. But basically, like, if you're in a clinic and a nurse, the actor here, offers a CAG, say, okay, do you guys want to be in a thing where, you pick up drugs for other people? First of all, the person has to find that acceptable and appropriate to be willing to join, right? Now, once you join, I think the preponderance of the literature says that there's basically 4 mechanisms by which it helps you. So there's within CAG social and effective support. So that's been documented in qualitative studies. Like you join a CAG, you meet people, they help you, they answer your questions, they give you sort of like psychological support. There is the notion that it does increase activation. So you have more self-efficacy. You have to know what drugs your neighbors are on. Therefore, you have to know what the drugs are. You have to be more proactive. And the idea is also that the social bonds push you to be more activated. Like you can't be a passive member of this group, right? You feel like you need to participate and contribute. The third one going down, opportunity cost. That's the most obvious one, right? You don't have to go so many times and spend so much money on transport. And then there's also another route that goes through opportunity cost, which is like if you actually decongest the clinics, like if all the people that didn't need to be there weren't there, then there would be like less waiting times. The providers in theory would be less burnt out. And then your experience, when you go there, number one will be better. And number two will be quicker, right? So that also helps reduce the opportunity costs. So these are kind of like 4 mediators or mechanisms. All those lead to on-time medication pickup and supposedly like better clinical outcomes, right? So this is a working mechanistic theory of this particular strategy. Okay, so our original problem was context. So how does this help us with context? So explanatory theory defines relevant context. And the mechanisms help us understand what about a particular set of local things matter for that thing, okay? So this is loosely based on a sort of a selection diagram kind of thing in DAG but we made decisions about what the mediators were that we cared about, right? And we drew those from like literature and theory. So we said acceptability was an important one of the CAG. We said that, and by the way, this is of the CAG. Like when we chuck acceptability onto a project without a causal explanatory understanding of what's going on, like I've seen countless projects where they put in acceptability and they end up measuring acceptability of ART, right? That's not what we want here. And an explanatory mechanism theory makes it absolutely clear acceptability of ART has no role here. But if you've been told that you need acceptability, you're like, well, acceptability of what? By who? But the fact that we decided that acceptability was of the CAG was an important piece of this, then we can ask what contextual differences would influence that. And again, in DAG land, the level of stigma in the community points into acceptability, which implies that between the two contexts, the level of stigma could affect the effect of a nurse offered CAG on acceptability, which will affect the total effect of the CAG. High stigma, less acceptability, less people join, less of an effect, obviously. Human resources for health. The variability in human resources for health will affect how much this decongest clinics, right? Like if the clinic wasn't that congested in the first place because it was a well-resourced facility, that mechanism, that branch of the mechanism is going to be less important. Geography and rurality. This is a key one. If this is a clinic in an urban place and everybody lives right around the clinic, then the fact that you have to go 12 times a year probably isn't that big of a deal because it's just down the street. That's a very different situation than living 40 kilometers from the facility. So the decisions that are made about what concepts populate the diagram inform, they in my mind, they act as receptors for the context. And that does a couple of important things. It sharpens our ability to think about context, right? So we go from like the statement that everybody says, which is context matters. We can go from that context matters to context that matters. We have context that matters for a specific strategy or intervention, which reduces this context task considerably. Okay. So I just want to use this to illustrate, like, to go back to the conceptual basis of like the trial 1.0, right? So this is our semi-populated, semi-enriched, semi-informed representation of how this works. Okay, that opens up a lot of conceptual possibilities. This is what it's a little bit of a straw, it's, you know, straw man. But this is like, I think how we, a lot of times taking a 1.0 like clinical trial mindset, conceive of what's going on. You have a thing, and then you have a clinical outcome. And what I care about is, does this thing lead to this thing? But in the middle, I have a conceptual blank slate. And with that conceptual blank slate, you lose the opportunity to think in a principled way um, about context and generalizability. Okay. I'm probably running out of time.
Well, no, you
Okay.
plus, yeah.
Okay. I don't think I have 15 minutes, but
You don't need to, no. Discussion will be good.
good. Yeah. So sorry. The last thing I was going to say about this is that like this can be translated into a quantitative analysis, right? So one of the benefits of like this there's a lot of like diagrammatic approaches to mechanisms and implementation strategies right now. Like the Kara Lewis Brian Weiner group are using CPDs. There's systems dynamics models and things like that. I like DAGs because of their brutal simplicity, and because it's a tool for rendering conception theory and testing it. Because once you have this in a DAG, like Perl will give you a way to estimate this, what you need to estimate it, and then what the estimates are. So it becomes I mean, to be kind of like concrete for a moment, if you do this in one setting and you measure these things, whether you do it qualitative or quantitatively, and you say the stigma is going to affect that, and then you know in a target place where you want to infer and one of your external validities, you say to yourself, well, if stigma affects this, I need to know stigma there in order to estimate the effect there. That's the first thing you learn. And the second is that if you know the stigma there, you can estimate the effect there, because the distribution of stigma in that external place is could be, you're saying, is different than it is here. And then third, if you don't know, then perhaps instead of doing this trial there, you just measure the stigma there, and then you adjust your effect for that there. Okay. All right. I'm just going to finish with some, I think, implications. I think in some ways it's taken me a long time and probably years to understand what I think the implications are. But number one, I think this reveals that like context is contextual. So the context that we care about depends on the strategy and the inference that we want, right? There's no universal set of contexts that matter for everyone all the time. If you're doing a lab-based intervention, you need a different kind of context than if you're doing a community-based intervention, right? And that is I think true sort of throughout. So I think that's one way to avoid the maybe context trap. There are Carl May has written about what context is very cogently, and I love all of Carl's stuff. And then there's a bunch of publications and implementation sites that try and categorize context comprehensively, right? So it's like the CFR of context. It's like these kinds of contexts, and then within these kinds of context domains, there are these kinds of like social political context, like economic context, and then they list like 1,000 things. Like that's. I'm not 100% sure what that will. I don't know. That reminds me a little bit of the EPI project, like 20 or 30 years ago, when people tried to name like every single kind of bias. It's basically it's all confounding or selection. But there's like you can find every kind of like bias and name it. Okay, mechanistic dependencies extend rather than attenuate generalizing. So one of the things that this does for us, I think, is it helps us clarify what generalizing actually is from a research or knowledge point of view. Because knowing that something doesn't work there is an act of generalizing, right? Like you saying, no, if I did this study here and I know it works there, that's generalizing. If I know it doesn't work there, that's also generalizing. What is not generalizing is I don't know if it's going to do anything there, right? So by understanding contextual dependencies, we can generalize even when the answer is different, potentially. And I would say that like this is just kind of like this is a thread of this that I've been kind of just becoming more and more aware of and trying to flesh out. But if generalizing is about taking information from here, if I'm doing a trial and I have a mechanism and combining it with information about there, what that implies is that the generalizing project is the product of a community of knowers rather than a study, right? So I, at doing a study, I want to create knowledge that's the most exportable. But whether or not it's generalizable can't be on me, right? It's on a community of knowers. And that implies that like knowing together is like how we generalize. And I think that like the reason why I'm kind of convinced about this from a science and public health point of view is because I think that's actually how clinicians practice like every day. This is the logic of practice, right? Because you take a study, that's the more you know about the mechanism of the treatment that you're considering, the better. And then but you're the one who knows this patient. Like the people who did the study didn't know this patient, and they don't know the ways in which they do fit and they don't fit. And so what you do is you combine that knowledge with the knowledge of the patient, and you decide whether or not those effects, you can say whether or not those effects apply. Because sometimes you say they don't apply. So I'm not going to treat this person with this. I mean, the most obvious examples are things like, chemotherapies that are dependent on like tumor things, or certain tumor cell surface markers and things like that. But at any rate, this is connected with like, I think a strand of thought in social epistemology that says that that better science is better scientific community. And like Sandra Harding's notion that objectivity is not the property of an investigator, but an epistemic community. Which I think is an interesting concept. Okay, and then finally, I think generalizing better. This goes back to the generalizing thing. And this is kind of a heuristic that I've been playing around with, but like, okay, so on the x-axis, this is works broadly. Sorry, the y-axis is works broadly. Okay, this is like, if you were like God, you could know whether or not CAGs would work like everywhere, right? And some things are going to work in a lot of different places. They don't require specialized training. They don't require specialized equipment. They fit within the workflows. They're well received by the community. So those things work, like they have effects in a lot of different places. Okay, that's the y-axis, right? Works in a lot of places, doesn't work in a lot of places. So that's a function of the treatment or the intervention. So the x-axis is knowledge about whether or not it works. These are two domains. These two things people often both call generalizing, but they're actually different. They're completely different. And if we like, I think we need to extricate them in order to move the science forward. So PRESSIS, for example, the pragmatic stuff, puts all these things in one thing. Your pragmagram, or whatever that thing is called, has both works broadly domains in it and knowledge about working broadly in it. So I think the y-axis is a problem of the strategy or the intervention. The x-axis is a problem of research. It's like, what do we know about those things? And I think that in the biological and clinical sciences, we can go for the top right. Like we can go for that. Works broadly and you know it. Like, so, like antiretrovirals. Like we know that all the people who need it, like 90 some odd % of people who need it, if they take it, it works. Like it does what it's supposed to do. Its biological effects, its clinical effects work very broadly. And the way that we do science, where we imagine one sort of out there truth, actually sort of works, right? But in implementation science, I would say that we need to go for the bottom right. Things are always going to work in certain settings. And what we would like to do is we would like to know what kinds of settings it works in and what kind of settings it doesn't. And like, in other words, what enables or disables its effects. And that's a different kind of generalizing. Sorry, that is the same in my mind in terms of generalizing, in terms of extending our knowledge about whether or not it works. Is different in terms of the nature of the treatment, and that there's nothing in implementation research that I think you can deploy everywhere and it'll always work. Okay, so that's I think that's it. We don't need to, I think to take stock, it's probably better to talk about it. So yeah, I hope this isn't, a little bit too, out there. I do also do empiric research. We have a trial actually that was years in the making and COVID tried to kill, but about helping healthcare workers be nicer and its effects on retention. That's just out in the Lancet HIV this week in Zambia. So encourage people to take a look at that. But yeah, so let me stop there.